Hey everybody, Todd Caponi here. And as you know me, I'm a nerd for the history of sales. Like when cool people are doing cool things on the weekends, you might find me reading a book or a magazine on sales or sales leadership from the early 1900s. Now, what's interesting is so many of the issues and challenges and problems that we face today were exactly the same 120 years ago. Except for one thing that I noticed is that forecasting did not seem to be an issue back then for sales leaders. And if you really think about it, there was no CRM solutions. If you were a leader, you barely ever even saw your reps, right? You communicated via wire. Telephones weren't even pervasive at the time. So, how were they able to forecast accurately? Well, I believe it was a systemic thing that they did right back 100 to 120 years ago that we do catastrophically wrong today. And here it is. I want you to remember back to the 1992 movie, if you've ever seen it, Glengarry Glen Ross. And in it, there's a scene where Blake, played by Alec Baldwin, goes on this tirade to the sales team that the last time I watched it on YouTube, and you should look it up if you haven't seen it. I think I cried myself to sleep afterwards. But there is one thing that he got right. He talks through something called AIDA, right? And in it, he actually gets one of the words wrong. But AIDA, it was a theory around what all of us as human beings, the process we go through to trigger a purchase decision. And it was originally theorized in 1898 by a guy named Elias St. Amalus. He theorized that every single buyer goes through four steps. They first pay attention to whatever the message is, and then they generate an interest. That interest eventually turns into a desire for that product or solution, and then they decide either to take action or not to take action, right? So AIDA. Now, AIDA actually became the philosophy, the sales process, and the way that every sales organization from the early 1900s through at least 1940 that I could find, the way that they thought about the sales process and their forecasting methodology. Every single one of them, wholeheartedly. The number two thing that I wanted to point out about that is, do you recognize something about AIDA? AIDA is about recognizing buyer behavior and buyer states, and that became the process that every single sales philosopher used. Literally every single one. The salesmanship magazines from 1905 to 1909, books like Norris Briscoe's 1919 book, Fundamentals of Salesmanship, and Arthur Dunn's book, one of my favorites of all time, Scientific Selling and Advertising from the late 1910s. Norval Hawkins, The Selling Process, 1920. In 1924, Elmer Ellsworth Ferris, in his book, says, all philosophers on sales concede this fact that buyers go through these four steps. Let's fast forward to 1993 when Siebel came out with their CRM, and then 1999 with Salesforce, and look at HubSpot. What are the sales process steps or the sales stages that are used by forecasting in all of those CRM solutions right out of the box? They're things like discovery, qualification, demo, proposal, commit. Those are all seller activities. We systemically, between the late 1930s to probably the 1980s, shifted our focus instead of recognizing buyer behaviors. We started focusing all of our endorphin rushes and our forecasting based on what we as sellers are doing. Who knew that our ability to forecast when a buyer might do something isn't going to be as accurate if all of our attention is focused on what we, the sellers, are doing? I think that's a huge miss. And I think there's an opportunity for us to think and go back to this idea of buyer centrism systemically in organizations, because I think that is the cause of a lot of our trust issues, but it's also the cause of a lot of our forecasting issues. And maybe it's not AIDA. I mean, name a company that's still using AIDA out there. There's probably not too many. But the modern version is this idea of every buyer goes through three states on their way to making a purchase decision. First one's why change. They decide whether their status quo is worth changing or not. And then the second thing they do is why you? Why your solution versus another solution? And then the third one is why now? Should we do this now versus do it at another time? And I'll argue the order with you on this all day long, but you'll see that it almost exactly matches what AIDA was. Think about this in your organizations. You can take your sales stages today and you can layer on top buyer centrism. Your sales leaders, everybody in your organization with a systemic focus on buyer behavior, I'm telling you, your forecast will become more accurate overnight, and your attentiveness to what customers and buyers are thinking, which really should be guiding all of your activities, should become a lot more fruitful as well. Give it a try. Am I crazy to think this? I would love your thoughts in the comments below. And if you need some help, reach out. Thank you.